So it's payday. The day you get paid, it's closing time, as they say in the song. And so you're going to go to the closing, your client's going to be there, and let's say it's your listing, and the buyer's going to show up and buy the home, and the monies are going to be traded, and everything's going to be signed, and the commission checks are going to be cut. It's a great day, closing day. All up until the point where one party or the other breaches the contract. Let's take a look.
Today's the big day, closing on the sale of your home. You'll sign the deed, give the deed to the buyer will accept it, and boom, title transfers to the new owner and your house is sold. Are you excited?
You have no idea. I'm so glad we were able to sell it at such a good price and to such a great buyer. Speaking of the buyer, what time is it? Shouldn't she be here by now?
Well, you know what? They are running a little late. And I've got other closings to get to. So we really got to get these things started.
Well, I just got off the phone with the buyer, and she's decided not to buy the house. She's refused to come to closing. As a matter of fact, she wants to buy another home, and she's asked me to write a purchase agreement for her on that property. No matter what I say, she's not interested. She's refusing to come to closing.
What? After all the hard work I've done? The packing, the cleaning, not to mention renting a moving truck? Now what am I supposed to do? Move everything back in? She can't do this, can she? Just change her mind on the day of closing?
Unfortunately, situations just like this do occur. They are hard and they are difficult. And all the times that you close a transaction with no problems, simple, smooth, and clean, when you actually feel like maybe you might have been overpaid for that transaction, as soon as that happens, you'll have one of these, because these are not fun. When somebody doesn't show up and is clearly in breach of contract, remember this though, you are not an attorney. You do not give a legal opinion about what's happening. What you have to understand though is at this point, your client's going to want to know, well, what do I do? And really, it is at this point that you generally want to have an attorney involved, because really the remedies have to do with a lawsuit. If that buyer in no way, shape, or form is going to show up, that seller does have some remedies, but it takes some time and some effort, and that property is not going to close that day, most likely. That's called a suit for specific performance, where the seller could actually force, through a lawsuit, the buyer to purchase the property, to actually follow through on the contract. Same thing, if a seller doesn't show up to closing and the buyer's there, what happens then? Same sort of an action where the buyer actually has to sue the seller in a specific performance, where the seller would actually have to turn over the deed and vacate the property. Very messy, very long, kind of an ugly situation. One of the things that you become aware of when you're in real estate is that if you feel there's a problem with your client, this comes into disclosure. If you know somebody's not going to perform and somebody's not going to show up to closing, you have a requirement, right, this disclosure requirement, that you do need to disclose to the other party that somebody is going to be leaving the transaction. There are some other remedies involved, and part of that, really has to come with maybe something that was already negotiated in your contract. If you look at the purchase agreement, it may say what happens in that agreement if somebody does breach the contract and doesn't actually perform. There may be what's called liquidated damages clause in there. Look for that clause and understand what that means. And many places you might get earnest money, or you may get the deposit as a seller to keep. But liquidated damages would be one of the things you'd look for. Other remedies would be partial performance. Now, what that means is you may actually have a problem. Like, let's say the buyer didn't show up because, well, let's say you were supposed to have painted over an offensive mural that you hand painted on your wall. And the buyer said, we'll buy the home, but we want that wall painted before we move in. And you get to the closing and the buyer says, I'm not closing because you didn't paint that wall. And the seller says, what are you talking about? We completely painted over it with white. And the buyer says, but I can still see the mural through it. You needed to do another coat. Well, you could accept, both of you, that, you know what, It isn't perfect, it's not what we wanted, but it's a partial performance of and you could both agree to go ahead and move forward with the contract and close the property. Right? You could also be a situation, and let's say it was that you had to paint the entire home, the outside of the entire home. And the seller had agreed to do that, but the buyer was going to close on it. And there was one little spot in the back of the house that had a little tiny mark on it where you could just see the old paint on it, but the whole the rest of the house was done. Well, that would be what we call substantial performance. And maybe there would be a small adjustment to the price of the home for that one little bit that wasn't painted that the buyer and seller could agree to, but it's a substantial performance, and it would allow them to continue to close on the property according to the contract. Some other things happen too, like let's say in order to perform on the contract, somebody had to do an illegal act. You can think of any number of things that may come to mind for an illegal act. Like let's say it was you needed to remove a retaining wall in the backyard. Well, it may be through a survey that we found out the retaining wall wasn't yours, wasn't the seller's, it was the neighbor's. And we can't actually go on the neighbor's property and remove that retaining wall. So legally, there could be an impossibility to perform. That could also lead to the fact that that would be almost overlooked in the contract and you could still close on the agreement. And then finally and ultimately, just about any contract that you're dealing with, you could also agree to continue to close if no matter what the problem was, as long as both parties agreed to close. Now this is the one that you want if you're in that situation. Because what happens is everything else gets uglier from that point on the day of closing if you can't get a mutual agreement. And you may hear of these kind of things with real estate agents giving up large parts of their commission in order to get a deal closed when there's a problem with the carpeting, or somebody moved a bed out of the master bedroom and the buyer realized that there was a hole in the carpet that needed to be fixed. And they didn't want to close because of the carpet. Well, I may have bought new carpet for a new buyer before out of my commission just to get the deal to close. So in the end, understand that there are many things that can go wrong. Generally, being prepared ahead of time helps you avoid those situations. But in the end, as long as you have a mutual agreement, there may be a way to remedy just about any problem you have and get the deal closed.